Are you stuck in the same old routine at work? Do you find yourself hitting a creative wall, unable to see beyond your current perspective? It's time to break free and unlock the power of fresh perspectives.
David Gouthro here with another episode of Discover Fresh Perspectives. And I'm just getting over a little bit of a cold. So if my voice fades out, that will be why. Either that or I just want to be really respectful of my guest today, who happens to be Devon More. Welcome, Devon.
Thank you, David. Thrilled to be here.
So, Devon, we met at a I don't know, it wasn't really a craft fair, a farmer's market in West Vancouver, and you were performing. And I loved your music. And I loved your dog, who at the time was dressed up as a lion. And I could have sworn it was a lion, but I now know that not to be true. So I'm so glad that you agreed to join in today.
Oh, yeah, I'm thrilled to be here, too. I will, for context, say that it was around Halloween. I don't have a dog dressed as a lion as part of my regular act. Although maybe I will, because how fruitful was it?
Well, it's certainly memorable. So just a little bit of input there. So, Devon, you love songwriting and performing, and is that something you've done since you were a wee tiny baby, or how did you come to have singing, songwriting as a source of passion? And do you do other things as well? Like that's hear just a little bit about you.
Yeah, great. I love to talk about myself. I have always been a little bit of a songbird. I don't come from a family of musicians, but I was always a noisemaker. And there is actually, my father used to work in the natural resource industry in Canada when I was quite young. And a couple of years ago, we found a cassette tape that we had recorded as kids to send to him when he was away at camp for a couple weeks. And I was probably maybe 6 or 7 years old, and I had to share the song I had written for him. I think it was "Do the Froggy Dance." It's very lyrically complex. But then I grew up playing flute, and I think just kind of at the time got sort of channeled into classical music. I guess you ask a 6-year-old girl what instrument she wants to play, and I was like, flute. I think I was a bit intimidated by the size of the cases for the other instruments. Like, how are you supposed to carry that around? And so I grew up playing classical music, and I thought I would be like a contemporary classical flautist for a lot of my youth. So it kept me in music, and I did some, music theory and a little bit of piano along with that. But it also kind of isolated me from songwriting a bit because I sort of got so, I don't know, enveloped in the classical canon and this idea that songs needed to be notated in traditional music notation or scored, or there was just this huge barrier between, the melodies that I would just sing off the top of my head and then the sheet music that I would sit down to learn and play. And so at a certain point, around the time I graduated from high school, I kind of realized I didn't think I liked practicing scales enough to be like a symphony orchestra flautist. And, at that point also, this is, before the internet. I grew up in Kamloops, BC too. So I didn't have a lot of role models for other avenues to being a musician. I knew my flute teacher played in the Kamloops Symphony Orchestra, and I knew my band teacher. He was an educator. And I was like, well, those are the two ways to be a musician. I don't know if I really fit into either one of those roles. And so I studied theater at university. Acting was kind of a parallel passion of mine. And then in an interesting twist of fate, what brought me back to songwriting was that 2 weeks after I finished my undergrad, my Bachelor of Arts, I fell off my skateboard and I fractured my skull. I suffered a traumatic brain injury that destroyed my sense of smell, but also a lot of the other equipment that's in the front part of your brain. So my prefrontal cortex got sort of decimated, which is an interesting brain injury to have because my speech wasn't affected. My physicality wasn't affected the way that, for example, a survivor of a stroke might have some discrepancies between their left and right side functionality. It was all just information processing and executive functioning and kind of long-term orientation or foresight or emotional regulation. That's sort of what your prefrontal cortex is responsible for. And so the sort of best way I could describe it is that if you lost your capacity for abstract thought, how would you ever know that? And I spent a few years kind of in this altered state of consciousness where I was present and I was animated, but I was pretty empty and processing the world through a pinhole, basically. And it was so alienating to just not really know what was going on most of the time. And I came to recognize I really needed my creativity as some sort of like tool. Like I needed something to help me, some sort of outlet to get me through this. And so I ended up getting a guitar about a year after that accident, maybe 15 months after that accident. And, theater had sort of lost its shine too. It's such a collaborative art form, and there's a lot of interpersonal difficulties that come with having a brain injury, both for me, but also for the people around me. So I kind of came back to songwriting partly because I just needed to somehow express myself, but also make sense of the world, because it didn't make sense to me. But if I could, it was incredibly kind of healing if I could capture a moment or a collection of ideas somewhat cohesively in a song. And then I could kind of put that up on the shelf. And it was sort of a way of kind of keeping track of things in an interesting way. I would never have known this at the time. I would not have been able to describe this. What I knew at the time is that learning cover songs were way too hard. I mean, it's compared to learning an instrument when you're 6 years old, learning an instrument in your like mid-20s. It's even if you don't have a brain injury, a very different learning curve. And I've always loved to sing. I felt kind of compelled to sing, but I just couldn't wrap my mind around most like how to learn cover songs as a new guitarist. And so kind of by necessity, I was like, I guess I'll write songs. What chords could I put underneath this, or what chords can I play, or what chords can I switch between? And I'll start with those building blocks.
That's incredible. So you couldn't have described what was going on for you at the time. And this is looking back now, and this is kind of like I'm trying to, I don't think I can imagine how that would feel, but you describe that looking at life through a pinhole.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't have a sense of what a pinhole is, that's everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
And you can't really compare it to something else, say this is good or bad.
Yeah, exactly. So, and gradually that pinhole opened up a little bit, and then just this, I mean, I think what's fascinating about this brain injury at this point, this is now nearly 20 years ago. Okay. So I can approach it with fascination, and I would never, ever wish this journey upon anyone. But I think there's a lot of universality to this, right? Like this sort of questioning of your own thoughts and beliefs. It's just that most of us don't have to do it in such an extreme way, we don't have to unpack the box. But as that pinhole widened up, it would be like, oh, okay, I can see now, I can see now a drinking straw's worth of the world. And I'm very confident in that drinking straw's worth of the world that I can see. But I can also remember when I could only sort of see this pinhole. And I do remember thinking at that time that I knew what was going on, right? And so even as my perspective broadened a little bit, there was this constant kind of back checking to be like, okay, now I think I have a handle on it. I think I know what's happening around me or what I'm processing. But this is also what I thought 2 months ago, or 6 months ago, or a year ago. And looking back now, I can see that at that point I also was not thinking clearly. So at what point, at what point do you begin to trust yourself? And that's I think it was a few years for me, but that was maybe premature in hindsight.
But I mean, also wonder that So you have yourself as a frame of reference, and that frame of reference is changing. But then there's also the frame of reference that other people have as well. And at what point you start comparing your frame of reference to someone else's rather than just an internal one. But I was also wondering, when you said you were starting to do this writing, was that something to help to open up the pinhole, or like which came first, the pinhole or the writing, or was there even a connection between the two?
I think consciously, no. I don't. I think it was just, I knew that, I'd always been musical or doing something creative, and I was feeling just really terrible most of the time for, months and months. And so I knew that doing something artistic would help. But theater, you have to be cast in something, but you can't really work alone as an actor that well. But I knew I'd always loved to sing, and I also knew enough about music to know that like a singer who is a cappella is like very limited, So I thought, okay, well, if I want to sing just kind of for my own purposes and practices, I'm going to have to either learn guitar or piano, like something that you could accompany yourself a little bit. And guitar was more portable. So that's how that's kind of how I decided that. But in what's so interesting about this whole journey is that now I know what I know. Like, I'm much more proactive about my brain maintenance and my mental diet and all these, and nutrition and all these things. But your vagus nerve, if you've ever heard of the brain gut connection, is it's like a good way to regulate your nervous system, to stay calm, to stay out of your trauma, to stay grounded in the present, is to calm your vagus nerve. And humming or singing does that inherently. And so in hindsight, when I look back, I can see that it would have just made me feel better in a way that I couldn't have explained at the time, to be singing, to be just making noise, making vibrations from my breath. But yeah, it wasn't necessarily that conscious. It was just sort of, I needed something.
So tell me a little bit about the music when you first started writing and started singing, and how it's evolving or how it's evolved. And also, you mentioned earlier that it was really hard to memorize cover tunes. And my daughter's 25 years old, and she can hear a song once and she's got it. And I could hear it 50 times. And I might know the tune, but I couldn't remember the words. You could hold a gun to my head. Probably that gets in the way of me being able to remember things anyhow. But I couldn't remember it. So that was the case a while ago. How has that changed? I guess that's sort of two paths of
Yeah.
How that's changed. The others, how your music has evolved.
Yeah, great questions. I mean, in terms of songwriting, I would say early on, I had very little control over my muse. I was generally motivated to write things that were getting under my skin, things that were bothering me, or things that for whatever reason were like plugging up that pinhole of perception, which was often difficult things or heartache or, even the world. And I just kind of learned by doing, like you learn the most basic chords on the guitar. And I had a musical ear, but I was always a flautist, right? That's the melody line. It's just on top of it. So in some ways, I think it was helpful that I didn't necessarily have a very rigid understanding of what chords should go together and how, because then I would have limited myself. But yeah, you practice. Does this sound okay together? Does this sound okay together? Can I physically do this? And if I could find something that worked in the chord structure, then melody has always just been something that comes relatively innately to me, and I could put a melody on top. But you learn over time too. Like, I had words sometimes that I really wanted to include, and I don't think that starting with text is the best way to write, because you kind of have to try and force it onto a melody. And then I toured for years, kind of one-woman shows on the Fringe Festival circuit, and that kind of gave me This is like years. It took years of me just writing songs for myself before I even wanted to perform, or before I even thought that it would maybe be something that anyone else should ever hear, But at a certain point in the progression, writing more songs, forgetting more songs, progressing in my musicality, I wanted to present publicly. And so then for years of touring kind of one-person shows with my own music in them, it gave me some direction in what I wanted to try to write songs about. So rather than just writing about my trauma or my irritations or my little, micro paper cuts, then I wanted to write a show about everything I learned while living in Berlin. So that I'm looking at, capitalism and socialism and ideas about Eastern versus Western kind of Cold War beliefs and walls, the metaphor of the wall, and the wall in Berlin or the walls in your brain. Or I toured a rock opera about quantum physics because I was sort of on a nerdy math bender, and I was thinking about what a character who was a theoretical physicist might do, with music. And now I think I've reached a comfortable place with my songwriting where number one, I trust that another song will always come. I don't know if you can relate to this as a creator in your own way, but early on, you're like sort of desperate to hang on to these tunes or melodies and catch them by the tail and not let them go. And because maybe it'll be the last melodic idea you ever get. I don't worry about that anymore because I know that there's peaks and valleys to it. But if I keep showing up and practicing, another song will always surface. And these days, most of my songwriting gets done if I'm just occupied doing something else, keeping my hands busy in this classic way where your brain is free to wander, but your body is kind of occupied in a kinesthetic way. I will often just find myself humming something or singing something. And if it's a nice little melodic line that I haven't heard before, I'll repeat it, or I'll jot it down in my voice memo app. Or if I got the time, I'll just stop and grab my guitar or something and lay down a few chords underneath it and just kind of capture them as they naturally arise rather than laboring over the process.
So there's a couple of things that I'm curious about. And, it's one thing to create privately and to do things just for yourself. There's something else about, when you're performing in public, there's, maybe I'm projecting here, but a sense of that requires some kind of a combination of courage and vulnerability, right? To actually put it out there. And do you recall when there was a transition? Because when you were going through your, while your brain was trying to get fired up again. I don't know what my question is. Just when you start to feel that it's I need to express, and where the sense of vulnerability or holding back is no longer an issue, because it's kind of like this pressure to get it out there that's greater than your resistance you might have, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And that's a good way of putting it, this kind of combination of courage and vulnerability. I think, I spent a couple years in Berlin, and that was really formative. There are so many creative people there. And so,
wait
I
a
had
second.
some.
Now, wait a minute. How on earth did you get to Berlin from Kamloops? There's not a direct.
Fair question. That's a fair question. This is, in hindsight, again, it's sort of shocking to me that this is the way it happened. But it was maybe 2.5 years after my brain injury. And I was still working the same restaurant job I'd been working during university. I was starting to recognize that I could make choices that would change what my future would be. And that's a weird thing to say, but I had spent a couple years just being like, do I have matching socks? Like just the day-to-day minutia of getting through days and like there's an incredible amount of information we process just in terms of what's going on in the environment and all that. But it was getting to a place where I realized, oh, I could make choices that would change what my future would be. And I had lived in Europe prior on a Rotary youth exchange in Holland for a year, just out of high school. And so I learned Dutch. I had my worldview just totally blown open. And I wanted to learn another language. And I just knew I would learn something about myself and about the world if I left Kamloops. And also, I really felt that shadow, I think, of being like, everyone knew that I'd had this brain injury. And through no one's direct fault, but like no one could really help me. I didn't really have any aftercare at the time, in just the way that sometimes these invisible injuries, or, it wasn't necessarily apparent in acute ways. And so I think I just thought, if I'm going to be brain injured and not really know what's going on, like if I put myself in a different environment, like it's weird to be in your hometown that you've lived in your entire life and not know what's going on. It is not that weird to not know what's going on in a foreign country where you don't speak the language that well yet. Like I think I didn't want to be in a space where everyone knew I had this brain injury, but no one could like talk about it or help me with it. I was trying to, to my own folly, just like run away from it, I think. And because I'd had the travel bug prior, and towards the end of my university career had been thinking about how I might be able to get overseas again, I knew that I could get a work permit for Germany for a year, like a working holiday. I'm not sure if they still have this visa sharing agreement, but at the time, Canada and Germany did. And so, yeah, I was like, I think I'm going to just move to Germany then. And I managed to talk one of my best friends into it as well, who we'd graduated at the same time, and we're both working at the same restaurant, and thought we could work in a restaurant somewhere cooler than Kamloops if that's all we're doing with our liberal arts degrees. And yeah, I had a 1988 GMC Sprint 4-door hatchback, tiny little thimble of a car that I knew I wasn't going to get any money for. So we drove in the direction of Germany. And against all odds, this car brought us to Halifax. And then we flew into Frankfurt, and the organization that had sort of facilitated us getting our visas had an orientation in Berlin as part of this visa sharing agreement to sort of tell you how to get a tax number and just all the bureaucracy that is so complicated when you're newly arrived in a new country. And so we kind of went under the assumption that we might get a job at a ski resort or some kind of seasonal work or whatever. But we went to Berlin for this orientation, and it was just so apparent immediately that the city had this really exciting energy and buzz and life and grit also, and scars and wounds, but also vitality to it. And I think, we just couldn't really think of a good enough reason to leave. And I think for me, it was so therapeutic to be in this place where, there was these, beautiful old regal stone buildings that also still had, bullet scars on them, or there was this combination of decay and, kind of what's the right word? Like a regalness in that decay that for me, I just needed to experience. Like, again, I wouldn't have put it together probably consciously, but for someone who was feeling really broken, to be in a place that had been completely decimated and then still had this incredible atmosphere and just authority to it was, there was just nowhere else. I couldn't think of a good enough reason to go anywhere else. And I stayed for almost 4 years on what was supposed to be like a one-year visa.
It's kind of like a metaphor for you, in a way, Berlin was. There's all these thoughts going through my mind, and, whether there's just the phrase leaving Kamloops is just stuck with me.
Mm-hmm.
as either the title of a memoir, or it could be a book, or it could be a movie, like with you and your friend leaving. Like there's a lot of great elements in there. And, I was picturing like this, our friend, the car that made it to Halifax. We were over in Germany for 4 years and came back. The car was right where we left. A little more rusted, much like other parts of my life that I moved on from. It's just so rich. Like I absolutely love it. And we haven't even talked about what kind of music you write.
Yeah, no, I mean, well, I will say, like Berlin, it was because I also, again, I didn't know it at the time, but I was being reprogrammed, like my worldview my Center for Information Processing had been sort of wiped out. And what a place to be reprogrammed in Berlin, where that city went through all the worst parts of history that the 20th century could throw at it, and emerged with like this very strong belief that like arts and culture are the most vital part of a civilization, or like the metric, the litmus test, right? Is your society functioning well enough that you have abundant arts and culture? And then the city itself reflects that. It's got sort of two, still the wall is gone, but it still had Western Berlin opera houses and Eastern Berlin opera houses, and the street art culture, and kind of the protest of the techno music, and yeah, the art galleries, and especially coming from Kamloops at a time where Kamloops has come a long way. I grew up in like, it was very blue collar, very pulp and paper mill town. And then to go to a place like Berlin, where if someone asks you, oh, what do you do? And you say, oh, I'm an artist or a musician or whatever. Their follow-up question was not, no, but what do you really do? The follow-up question would be like, tell me more, tell me more about your art or your medium. And so, yeah, it was just the universe works in mysterious ways, and putting me in that city. And then I ended up getting a job in this kind of dive bar that was run by renegades from New York, that also at this point happened to serve like the only decent hamburger in Berlin. This is a little bit of a side tangent, but like for context, red meat culture in Germany, like red meat, beef, this is a very North American ranch lands type thing. It takes a lot of space and effort to be able to eat red meat regularly, or the way that we do. And German red meat culture is kind of cooked well done and served with butter, and we served like fresh ground burgers cooked to order. And so it was like the UN of anemic misfits and globetrotters and bureaucrats and other musicians and like spies, like all sorts of East Germans kind of looking to get a hint of that American kitsch. And then the expat community too. Like I just met so many amazing and incredibly unique people, and sometimes just, while they were in for a pint and a burger, and maybe that was it. But in terms of like having new ideas embedded in my brain, I don't know how it could have been better done than that.
It's like I'm still stuck visually on the metaphor. I just feel like ongoing opening or unfolding or something like that. And once something opened up, there was something else to open up. There's so many different levels or layers that were there. They couldn't see all at once. Things had to be revealed a little bit at a time, but there was always more. It sounds very similar to what your life has been like. The parallels, anyhow, I'm finding quite striking.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think everyone's life is like that. I think, there's this natural unfolding of things and causality, that if you're open to just kind of taking the opportunities that present themselves to you, or that like feel right. I don't necessarily recommend making all your decisions without kind of some attention to your executive functioning or your long-term planning, or your, kind of more like rational thought. But again, looking back, I could see how I wouldn't have made some of those decisions. And maybe there's something to be said for that too.
So I'd still like to hear a little bit about your music, right?
Yeah, great.
Yeah, that, and I'll make sure that in the program notes we put your music where you can get it. But I'm just curious about what if there is a genre, or if it's all over the map, or what you currently really enjoy writing.
Yeah. In my soul, I think that I'm a folk singer because I have always been motivated by storytelling in my songwriting. And maybe that's a bit of the theater hangover too, like I'm always trying to capture a moment or complete a little narrative arc in my songs. But yeah, I guess maybe that's another way that I'm a bit of a fish out of water because in my live performances, I work with the loop station so that I can kind of build my multi-instrumental arrangements. I use a electric guitar that goes through an FX pedal so I can make a bunch of different tones with my guitar, and I'll layer in some flute and glockenspiel and all sorts of stuff. And then you can't call yourself like an electro folk artist because so this is where I get a little bit lost on myself. So I've settled on alternative folk. I would generally describe myself as an alternative folk music maker. But I don't know how like the traditional folk community would feel about that because there's some you remember what happened to Dylan when he when he plugged in his guitar. So yeah, I don't know what the real balances are, but I do have some sort of orchestral nuance that comes into it because I am still like resting on a bed of classical music that to me is very expansive. Like I tend to write. I write in different time signatures, for example. Like I will write in common time in 4/4, but I also like to write a waltz now and then. Or one of my proudest accomplishments on the album I put out last year was a song in 5/4, which is it's tricky for me to write in. And my favorite time signature is 12/8. But that's just, I think coming from classical music, a song could be written at any tempo, in any key, for any purpose. There's like, especially over the course of a symphony, there's all sorts of moments that get built into that. And it's interesting to me when I look at sort of electronic music, for example, it's pretty much all in 4/4. And depending on whether it's like house or drum and bass, these subcategories of it all fall within the range of a couple BPM, a relatively narrow range in terms of tempo, because it was designed for, dance floors and DJs to be able to go from one song to the next one. That makes sense in a practical way. But I think it never occurred to me to limit myself in terms of tempo or key or time signature, because, maybe there's one for every moment.
So for those listeners who aren't familiar with some of the acronyms, rather than asking you about these, Devon, I'm going to suggest that people, look up some of these terms. Loop and looping. Okay, check into that. Don't you tell them, Devon, if they're curious, to look it up.
Yeah.
And BPM, okay, because it's that's another one that's good to know. But don't tell them what it is. They have to look that up. Okay, this is
that
great.
One you'll remember. Yeah.
Yeah, our hearts kind of sometimes measure the same way. That's fabulous. So maybe just a little bit more. So it sounds like your process is sometimes just all of a sudden you'll be doing something that has nothing to do with music or whatever, and tunes will come to mind or things like that, and you start to capture them. So, from, if there is even a way to answer this question, from start to finish, you're creating something that you're now going to record and put on a CD or a DVD or a tape for those older members of the listening audience.
Mm-hmm.
So how
reel to reel.
Yes, exactly. My gosh. So what's the process or the length of time something like that might take? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, and I will say that I also, part of my songwriting process is that I have a notebook or a virtual notebook. And if I ever hear a turn of phrase or, some found poetry, I describe it as, or often like a couplet will come to me, I'm always jotting down word candy so that if I do have a melody appear, that I can kind of go to that as an inspiration board to see what kind of words maybe want to attach themselves to the to the melody. And then, sometimes here, I think a song is done when it has a melody with words and a chord structure underneath it. I also, generally speaking, like I do have, I guess, a pop music writing sensibility in that to me, a song should have a verse section, a chorus section that are visited at least twice each, and then a bridge or a section 3, a little like a counterpoint in the song. So to me, if I have a song and I know what the chords are and I know what the melody is, and I feel like I've told a complete story, and it's got, all these sections, then it's done. The song is done to me. But that sometimes will only take a few minutes, though sometimes I've also labored over those stages for, years to find the right words or to come back to something or an idea that wasn't quite ripe yet. But the studio process is a whole nother beast because the song gets rebuilt to me in the studio. Like what I love about the live looping is it allows me to kind of put a bunch of different elements together and build a bit of an arrangement. But when it comes time to build a song in the studio, you don't have the restrictions of the loop station. You can do anything. And I feel like this is one of my areas that I'm still really developing in is which elements to narrow it down to and which choices to make in the studio, which direction, how full to make things, how sparse. And songwriting for me typically, though I have played in a band before and I really like writing with other people, songwriting is often a solo process for me. But the studio stuff is collaborative. So then it's not just my opinion, there's other creatives involved too. And yeah, that could take ages. Like I put out an EP in 2014 and I didn't put out my full album until 2024. So
Wow. Okay.
like I think it takes I would do things differently in the future, but yeah, there's sort of 2 steps to it. For me, the birthing of the song, the chord structure, the basic kind of elements of the song, it's always ongoing, and some of them never need to become studio versions. Sometimes they're just songs you need to write in order to get to the next song that you're going to write that's a keeper. But the studio process, I think I will spend the rest of my life tinkering with in order to dial that in.
So maybe one last question, regardless if you're doing it in your home or in your studio or whatever. How conscious are you of who you're writing for, in the sense of, are you writing for you to satisfy you, or are you thinking about the consumer of the music and what they might like or want, or what's the balance between those two, if there is such a thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am writing for myself first, just because if I don't like it, why would anyone else, I guess? And I love to sing. So if I find a melody that is fun to sing, I do think about other people being like, I think this is fun to sing. I hope that they will enjoy singing along to this. It brings me joy to move my voice around in this way, and I hope they like it too. But I do consider, I'm mindful of my lyrics. I do consider that these songs will be heard by other people. And it's not that I picture one specific person in mind, but I think about myself as a very musical young person. And I think about myself like in my late teen years. This was around the time that, Britney Spears was breaking out. And as I watched that pop music environment kind of unfold, I felt so disconnected from music. This pouty face and the kind of sexualized lyrics, like just didn't. And then I've always listened to lyrics too, so it always bothered me if I felt people were kind of wasteful with their lyrics, or if you're going to use words, you should say something, right? And if you are a young woman who loves to sing and you're listening to the radio, because that's how we were listening to music back then, when you pay attention to the lyrical content, almost every song that is on commercial radio voiced by a woman is about a heteronormative relationship. If you tune in, most women who are allowed to be heard loud and proud on commercial radio are singing love songs or heartbreak songs or longing for someone songs. And, I think, music could do so much more than that. So I like to put thought-provoking lyrics on melodies that are so irresistible, thinking like, maybe someone won't be able to help but sing along to this. And in being unable to resist the melody, will also then have to voice these words. And maybe they're a positive affirmation that will make you feel better about yourself or your situation, or make you feel seen, or maybe they're something that helps you make sense of something tricky that's happening in the world, or some sadness, or maybe they just kind of open up your worldview a little bit. I will say, when my nieces were very young, one of them came home from a birthday party with like a mixed CD compact disc she'd received as a party favor, and it had like all the pop music kind of hits on it, and the Katy Perry song, I think it's called Last Friday Night, was on it. And my nieces were maybe like 3 or 4 and 6 years old at the time, maybe a little older. And they were starting to parrot back some of these Katy Perry lyrics. And this is your last assignment that David and I are going to give the listener, is go read the lyrics to this Katy Perry Last Friday Night song. It's like, what happened? I think we got drunk, but I forgot. And like, just what I was like, how deplorable that we're putting these words in the mouths of these young girls. And so that was one of those moments that stuck with me too, where I do think about, would I want my niece or nephew to say these words out loud, to like sing their guts out to these words?
So, I have some, when you describe the kind of music you like and that you don't like, it occurred to me that I have some very, very good friends who I would love to find a way to get you all together one time at a restaurant just to chat about this. Cause, Andrea Menard is a wonderful friend, singer-songwriter. Karen Fowley is local. Sherry Elric is, same sort of thing. Like the kinds of music that you described, you wouldn't want your nieces to listen to. I've never heard any of that kind of music coming from these people. And Janice Stanfield, like it's all just, really good. It's about much bigger life than that tiny, narrow little piece. It's all about the relationships, and that life doesn't count outside that. So if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to see if I can pull that together, because I would love to be able to witness that and maybe be the person that's serving you tea.
Oh, great. Yes. I love a good philosophical unpacking of all things creative, or just all things philosophical. So that's
quite one. And some guys too, like Nathan Aswell and Lowry Olafson, and most of them are local here except for Jana. So that'd be very cool. Devon, I would like to thank you so much for being willing to be on this podcast. Now, we talked about it years ago, literally, and it's happening. And so thank you so very, very much for being here with me today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for what you're doing too. Like, what a wonderful gift to be putting out there in terms of content. There's a lot of stories, a lot of messaging that's going out into the world, and inviting people to talk about the things that light them up rather than the things that terrify them, I think is important.
And I will continue to do that. So this has been David Gouthro, Discover Fresh Perspectives. Come on back again next week. Get some different perspectives from a different but equally wonderful person. Thank you very much for listening.
Subscribe now, because on Fresh Perspectives, every episode is an opportunity to explore new horizons and redefine what's achievable.